Welcome to A Cloud of Witnesses. This is an in-depth series on the history of the Christian faith. In this video, we'll focus on the Catholic response to the Protestant Reformation. This is commonly called the Counter Reformation. One of the key responses in this Counter Reformation was for the calling of a Catholic council. This council was held in the Italian city of Trent and is consequently known as the Council of Trent. We'll also note the emergence of Catholic mission, in particular on the formation of the Jesuits by Ignatius Loyola and the impact and influence of the Jesuits in both Asia and what is called the New World, today known as the Americas. From an initial rapid expansion, eventually the growth in the Protestant churches slowed. And there were a number of reasons for this. One of them was the Peasants' War of 1525. Although Luther had opposed this strongly, the Protestants were blamed for the revolt and for thus upsetting the established social order. There were fanatical Anabaptist groups, and they caused others to be wary of all Protestants. There were also divisions among the Protestants themselves. There was persecution. The French Protestants, such as the Waldenses, the Huguenots, along with the Anabaptists, all suffered greatly under the Catholic French rulers. There was wars and armed conflict. For example, in 1547 there was the Schmalkaldic War between Catholic and Protestant regions or states within the Holy Roman Empire. And finally, the Catholic Church organised itself to fight against Protestantism. This was called the Counter Reformation. The Catholic Church responded to the Protestants in a number of different ways. There was the Spanish Inquisition, which was used to crush non-Catholic opinions in Spain and in Italy. Many thousands of people were tortured or killed, and so the later Protestant reform really never had an opportunity to take hold there. The Oratory of Divine Love was made up of priests and lay people who initially met in Genoa in Italy and then later moved to Rome. The group desired a more spiritual form of Catholicism, and they didn't meet as a response to the Protestant movement, as it had its origins prior to the Reformation taking hold. But the Oratory of Divine Love did influence later developments. Although numerically small, it had many influential leaders. For example, one of their members, Giovanni Carafa, became Pope Paul IV. Many new Catholic orders were established as a result of the influence of this group. For example, Gaetano di Tien began the order of the Theatines. The chief aim of the Theatines was to call the clergy and laity to live more virtuous and moral lives. There was also the order of the Capuchin friars, which emerged from the Franciscans, and as well the Ursuline order of women. The Jesuit order was formed by Ignatius Loyola in 1539 and was then spread by the missionary activity of Francis Xavier. This order was made up of preaching and teaching monks who were ordered to win back people to the Catholic faith. They strongly emphasised education, and even today Jesuits have a strong role in Catholic education. Catholic missionaries went to Asia and then later to Central and South America. There was also the Council of Trent, which we'll look at shortly. Then there were mystical groups. Teresa of Avila in Spain began living an ascetic life and joined a convent. She claimed that she had many visions from Jesus. She also claimed to levitate She reformed the Carmelite order, which had been started in the 12th century, addressing what she perceived to be spiritual lackness. She had much stricter rules, and she emphasised abject poverty, ceremony flagellation, which is a form of beating, and walking barefoot. She helped found about 17 convents, and this had a particular impact in Spain. Persecution of the French Protestants, called the Huguenots, had begun after the Placards incident and continued and escalated through the 16th century. Large-scale persecution began in 1572, beginning with the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. It was Pope Paul III who saw that the Protestant Reformation was no longer confined to a few preachers, but had won over various princes, particularly in Germany. As a result, he called for a church council to address the issue. Pope Paul was more conciliatory towards the Protestants than his predecessor had been, and he had initiated several internal church reforms. He was happy, for example, for Cardinal Contarini to meet with Philip Melanchthon at the Diet of Regensburg in 1541 in order to reconcile these differences. While some agreement was reached at Regensburg, such as over the doctrine of justification, it was not agreed to by other Lutherans and was also later rejected by Catholics at the Council of Trent. Later, Pope Paul IV was more hardened in his view towards the Protestant Church. The Council of Trent was held from the years 1545 to 1563. The history of the Council is divided into three distinct periods or sessions. The first session was held between the years 1545 to 1549, the second in the years 1551 and 1552, and the third and the final session 1562 and 1563. During the second period of the council meeting, Protestants were invited and actually attended. They asked for a renewed discussion on the points that had already been defined, and for bishops to be released from their oaths of allegiance to the Pope, and that councils should be supreme, not the papacy. However, when the last period began, all intentions of conciliating the Protestants was gone, and the Jesuits had become a strong force within the council. Ultimately, the three periods reaffirmed the Catholic position on transubstantiation, justification by faith and works, the 7 sacraments, the celibacy of the clergy, the existence of purgatory, indulgences, and the Pope's authority was re-emphasised. Not much was changed theologically. It set a clear position for the next 4 centuries of Catholic belief, and it wasn't until the Second Vatican Council of the 1960s that the Church dramatically changed. There were some changes brought about through the Council of Trent, and these focused more on dealing with the moral, ethical abuses within the Church. And these changes included condemning the abuses connected with the distribution of indulgences, abolishing the position of the indulgence seller, the better training of priests, and the establishment of seminaries. They were to be better educated in matters of theology and also apologetics. The papal authorities also sought to educate the faithful about the meaning, nature, and the value of artwork and liturgy, Political appointments of bishops was to be no longer tolerated. There was opposition to clerical absenteeism, and this was the practice of bishops living in Rome or on landed estates rather than in their diocese. And also plural bishoprics were abolished. Bishops were given greater power to supervise all aspects of religious life. The index included works by Luther and Calvin, but it went well beyond just them. The list included German and Italian translations of the Bible. Interestingly, the index was only abolished in 1967. Pope Paul IV was a hardline enforcer of Catholic orthodoxy. It was he who formulated the index, the list of forbidden books. Pope Pius IV allowed the cup to be given to the laity in the areas of Austria and Bohemia. Perhaps this was in deference to the Hussites, as this is where many of them lived. Charles Borromeo was an Italian archbishop from Milan. He was the nephew of the Pope Pius IV. He was responsible for significant reforms in the Church, including the founding of seminaries for the education of priests. As the Archbishop of Milan, he was particularly concerned about some of the things that were happening in his diocese. For example, its clergy and laity had drifted from church teaching. The selling of indulgences and ecclesiastical positions was prevalent. Monasteries were, according to him, full of disorder, and many religious leaders were, quote, lazy, ignorant, and debauched. And so Charles made numerous pastoral visits and tried to restore the Catholic Church to its moral position. Because he believed that abuses going on in the church had come about because of ignorant clergy, he focused on training priests in seminaries, colleges, and other communities. The Roman Inquisition began in 1542 as part of the Catholic Church's Counter Reformation against the spread of the Protestant movement. While it was less harsh than the previously established Spanish Inquisition, this was cold comfort as the Spanish Inquisition was particularly brutal. The Roman Inquisition took place primarily in Italy. It's thought that there were between 50,000 to 75,000 cases that were judged by the Inquisition in Italy after 1542. And of these, around 1,250 resulted in an execution of some sort. The Roman Inquisition stopped the Protestant movement from gaining any foothold in Italy. Apart from trying to suppress Protestant ideas, others came under the condemnation of the tribunals that were set up. Two famous examples are the astronomers Copernicus and Galileo, who both fell foul of the Roman Inquisition. Despite the Counter Reformation, the Protestant Church survived and remained firmly entrenched in a number of countries. Eventually, England and Scotland would become Protestant too. Many religious refugees from there and from continental Europe would also seek a new life in North America, firmly establishing the Protestant Church there. One individual who wanted to bring about change in the Catholic Church was the Spanish priest Ignatius Loyola. In 1534, Ignatius and a few like-minded friends made a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But note, the obedience was to the Pope, not to God. In 1539, they founded the Society of Jesus, otherwise called the Jesuits. It was founded to strive especially for the propagation and defence of the faith and progress of souls in Christian life and doctrine. Loyola was influenced by the life of Francis of Assisi and emphasised simplicity and asceticism. Loyola also had a more mystical approach to Christianity, and he claimed to have visions such as those of Mary and of the infant Jesus. The Jesuits would be mission focused, and like friars, they would travel and teach as they went. Unlike other orders, the Jesuits tended not to have a specific habit or form of dress. Loyola said, "Teach us, good Lord, to serve you as you deserve, to give and not count the costs, to fight and not to heed the wounds, to toil and not to ask for rest, to labour and not to ask for any reward, save knowing that we do your will." As the Portuguese explorers opened up parts of Africa and Asia through trading settlements, some Catholic missionaries, predominantly Jesuits, arrived, and these included Francis Xavier, Gonzalo da Silveira, Matteo Ricci, and Robert de Nobili. Perhaps the most famous Jesuit was Francis Xavier. He was a missionary from Portugal who left Portugal with two other Jesuits in 1541. He initially went to Mozambique in Africa and then on to Goa in India. The Portuguese had been there for 30 years already, and there was an existing clergy, but mostly within the walls of Goa, ministering to the Portuguese living there. Xavier spent 3 years working and preaching to people groups who lived on the coast, south of Goa. Some of them had been baptised earlier. He established about 40 Catholic churches there, although generally did not have a lot of success. He then went to Malacca in Malaysia, where again there was a Portuguese trading settlement. There was a Portuguese trading settlement in Malacca, and in fact there's still a Portuguese community there today. And Xavier enjoyed the political support and the protection from the Portuguese government. He then went to the Moluccas in modern-day Indonesia for some time and then returned back to Malacca. On his return, he met a Japanese man who accepted the Catholic faith, and he would later be a useful intermediary and interpreter for Xavier. In 1548, he and 3 other Jesuits, along with his Japanese mediator and interpreter, arrived in Japan. Because he came as a representative of the Portuguese king, he was received warmly. He worked there for 2 years and some Catholic communities were established there. He returned to Malacca and then made an attempt to visit China. In 1552, he landed off the coast of China and he died there as a result of a fever shortly after. His impact was more widely felt in India and in the East Indies, Malacca and parts of Indonesia. He did make a request to set up the Goa Inquisition, and this was done so after his death. And this Inquisition persecuted Hindus, Muslims, and many others. Silveira was also a Jesuit from Portugal. He travelled to Mozambique and went to the Shona people in modern-day Zimbabwe and he baptised its king. Eventually, Portuguese traders arrived and convinced the king that Silveira was a spy and a practicer of magic. Silveira refused to flee and was later strangled to death in his sleep. Although at least a dozen Catholic churches were planted after Silveira's death, they all disappeared by 1667, and there was no discernible trace of Christianity until Protestant missionaries arrived in the 19th century. Matteo Ricci was an Italian Jesuit who went to China. Ricci arrived at the Portuguese settlement of Macau in 1582. The Portuguese had established an important trading port at Macau, which is not far from present-day Hong Kong, and Macau would become an important base for Jesuit missionaries. And in 1594, a Jesuit university called St. Paul's College was opened, and this would also become an important training college for Jesuits. While at Macau, Ricci studied the Chinese language and customs and also learned how to read Chinese. In Macau, there had been some Catholic mission work in China, but it had been confined mostly to the city, and only a small number of Chinese had converted. Together with a fellow Jesuit, he established other missions outside of Macau, including one at Nanjing in 1595. It was while he was in Nanjing that he met Xu Guangqi, and he helped Ricci translate several Western classical texts into Chinese, as well as several Chinese Confucian texts into Latin. Through Ricci's influence, Xu became baptised as a Roman Catholic, and he would become an influential Catholic leader in China. In 1598, Ricci visited Beijing, but was unable to enter the so-called Forbidden City, the home of the Chinese Emperor. However, 3 years later, he returned to Beijing with permission by the Emperor to become his advisor. He stressed friendship and became a popular and respected scholar there. He worked quietly at mission, and a small group of believers, all part of the intellectual elite, later influenced others. Over time, he had about 6,000 followers. Soon other Jesuit missionaries arrived. In 1611, Nicholas Trigault, but called Trigautius, a French Jesuit, landed at Nanjing in China. He returned to Rome 2 years later in 1613 to report on the progress of the China mission. A few years later, he recruited 20 new Jesuit missionaries, and they sailed from Lisbon and arrived in Macau, China, in 1619. Some Jesuits obtained positions of great influence. For example, Johann Adam Scholl von Bell, who was a German Jesuit missionary. He was part of the Jesuit group that had arrived in 1619 under the leadership of Trigautius. He arrived in Beijing in 1630. By 1644, he'd become the trusted counsellor of the Shunzi Emperor of the Qing dynasty and was given the official title of a mandarin or minister to the emperor. He also held an important post in connection with the mathematical school. His position enabled him to gain the emperor's permission for the Jesuits to build churches and to preach throughout the country. It's claimed that during a 14-year period, around 500,000 Chinese were said to have been baptised by Jesuit missionaries. By around 1687, there were about 200 Jesuit churches and missions that had been established across China, as this map shows. It's thought that from 1552, which was the year that Francis Xavier died, to 1800, a total of 920 Jesuits participated in the China mission. Of these, just over 300 were Portuguese and about 130 were French. Despite early claims of success, by around 1840, China may have only had about 240,000 Roman Catholics. The Jesuits received a significant blow to their mission work when in 1762 the Portuguese king ordered the confiscation of all Jesuit properties and the arrest of all members of the society in Macau. In Macau, the Jesuit University, St Paul's College, which had been opened in 1594, was closed. This, as we've said before, was an important base and training college for Jesuits, not only in China, but also in Japan and East Asia. Eventually, by the early 19th century, all Jesuit workers from China had disappeared, and the Catholic Church there suffered a severe setback. Catholic mission had also suffered a severe setback in Japan when the Tokugawa shogunate decided to ban Catholicism in 1614. Many Jesuits were tortured and killed. Around 1650, the expulsion of all European missionaries and the execution of all converts was ordered. Nobly, an Italian Jesuit went to India in 1605. He mastered Sanskrit, Telugu and the Tamil languages, as well as studying their literature. He dressed and he lived by the Brahmin, which were the upper caste in India. He also adopted the local Indian customs, such as shaving one's head and keeping only a tiny tuft of hair. He wore a white dhoti, like a white pair of pants, and wooden sandals. By reaching the upper caste, he thought that the lower caste would follow the example of their superiors. He worked for just over 50 years in India. A number of Jesuit missionaries also went to Vietnam, where they established the Catholic Church. Francisco de Pina arrived in Macau, near modern-day Hong Kong, in the year 1611. Then in 1617 he travelled to the territory of Dang Trong, which was in the area of modern-day southern Vietnam. There had already been some Jesuit missionary activity there. For example, the Portuguese Jesuit Francesco Buzomi had landed in Da Nang in 1615 and had set up a mission there. And then in 1618 he set up another mission at Pulo Cambay. De Pina learnt fluent Vietnamese and urged other Jesuits to also learn the language of the people they were working with. As a result of his language skills, he became a Vietnamese interpreter for the Portuguese. He then worked on and created the first Latinized script of the Vietnamese language. The modern Vietnamese alphabet is based on his work. De Pina drowned in 1625. Alexandre de Rhodes was a Jesuit from France. He arrived in Dang Trong in 1624 and learnt the Vietnamese language from De Pina. In 1627, de Rhodes and another Jesuit missionary travelled to the northern part of Vietnam and settled in the capital of what today is modern-day Hanoi. He stayed 3 years, and in his reports he says that about 6,000 Vietnamese were converted. Also during his time there, he wrote a Catholic devotional book in Vietnamese. In 1630, he was exiled. He then spent 10 years in Macau before returning back to Dang Trong. During his time in Vietnam, he wrote the first trilingual Vietnamese, Portuguese, Latin dictionary. However, after 6 years, he was again exiled. He returned to Europe and was instrumental in establishing the Paris Foreign Missions Society in the year 1659. Between the years 1660 to 1700, about 100 Catholic missionaries were sent to Asia by the Paris Foreign Missions Society. They not only went to Vietnam, but to other places such as modern-day Cambodia and to the kingdom of Ayutthaya, which is in modern-day Thailand. King Narai, who ruled the Ayutthaya kingdom from 1656 to 1688, was particularly receptive to these Catholic missionaries. However, after his death and the resulting Siamese revolution that took place, Catholic missionaries were expelled from the kingdom. This expulsion lasted for the next 100 years. The navigator and explorer Ferdinand Magellan arrived in the Philippines while on his circumnavigation of the world in 1521. He spent some weeks near the island of Cebu, and it is claimed that about 2,000 of the locals were converted. Magellan also claimed the territory as a colony for the Spanish Empire. Yet it would not be until 1565 that Catholic missionaries arrived from Spain. It was under the direction of Miguel López de Legazpi that the Catholic faith was established in the islands of the Philippines. Legazpi was the first Governor-General of what was called the Spanish East Indies. It was on the orders of the Spanish king that he left Mexico with 5 boats and 500 soldiers to go to the Philippines. Members of his expedition also included 6 Augustinian missionaries. He established their settlement on the island of Cebu, and it remained the capital until 5 years later, when in 1571 he moved it to the present site of Manila. The task of bringing Christianity to the islands was made difficult because from about 1350 onwards, Islam had been spreading northward from Indonesia into the Philippine archipelago, and was, by the time of the Spanish missionaries, firmly established on the islands of Mindanao and Sulu, and there are also outposts on Cebu and Luzon. Carrying on the historical practice of expelling Jews and Muslims from Spain, Legazpi dispersed the Muslims from Luzon and the Visayan Islands and began the process of Christianization. Andreas de Urdaneta was one of the Augustinian monks who'd arrived with Legazpi from Mexico. Although he only stayed on the island of Cebu for less than a year, he had an important role in establishing the Catholic faith there. With Columbus's discoveries in 1492, as well as his other explorations after that, and Magellan's trip around the world in 1521, the so-called New World opened up. That is, South America and eventually North America. Initial Portuguese and Spanish explorers were followed by settlers who went into the areas of the New World. As they did so, Catholicism began also to spread into these areas. An Italian who was supported by the French was the first European to discover parts of North America. However, it would be about 60 years before the French established permanent settlements in North America. As the Catholic Church established itself in the New World, some of their leaders executed their duties faithfully. However, others were only political appointees, and they weren't concerned for the plight of the ordinary native Indian people based in the Americas. In contrast to this, many of the missionaries, including the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and the Jesuits, they lived among the Indians. They understood their plight, and in many cases protected their interests against the settlers. In particular, men such as Montesinos, Las Casas, Junipero Serra, and Juan de Estrada Ravago were noted for their compassion, and they protected the native South American Indians. Pedro Claver also worked amongst the African slaves which were being brought to the Americas at that time. Antonio de Montesinos was a Dominican friar. He arrived on the island of Hispaniola in the year 1510 and lived there. He opposed the enslavement of the native people of the Americas by the Spanish colonists. This enslavement had come about through the Spanish idea of encomienda, which literally means trusts. The encomienda was a Spanish decree that rewarded conquerors. It stated that the conquerors could exact a tribute or a tax or labour from the indigenous subject people living in their particular area. The encomienda became a system of institutional slavery of the native peoples. Those who held such slaves were called encomenderos. Montesinos said that the Spanish on the island were, quote, all in mortal sin and live and die in it because of the cruelty and tyranny they practice among these innocent peoples. Montesinos preached a powerful sermon. Tell me, by what right of justice do you hold these Indians in such a cruel and horrible servitude? On what authority have you waged such detestable wars against these people, who dealt quietly and peacefully on their own lands? Wars in which you have destroyed such an infinite number of them by homicides and slaughters never heard of before. Why do you keep them so oppressed and exhausted without giving them enough to eat or curing them of the sicknesses they incur from the excessive labour you give them, and they die, or rather you kill them, in order to extract and acquire gold every day? Montesinos had a strong influence on one of the first Spanish colonists, Bartolomé de Las Casas. He also lived on the island of Hispaniola, and he knew of Montesinos' criticism of the system of enslavement of the indigenous people. He became an ordained priest and participated as a chaplain in the Spanish conquests of the native people in Cuba. He later said, I saw here cruelty on a scale no living being has ever seen or expects to see. As a reward for his work, he received an encomienda. However, in 1515, through his reading of a passage from Ecclesiasticus and from the injustices he had seen, he felt compelled to oppose the abuses committed by colonists against the Native Americans. Then he gave up his encomienda and he began preaching against the abuses by the Spanish colonists of the indigenous peoples. In 1515 he went to Spain and he advocated before the King, Charles V, who was also the Holy Roman Emperor, on behalf of the rights for the natives. He worked hard to protect the interests of the Indians and had laws enacted in Spain which protected them, but which were not enforced in the New World. He returned to the Americas and tried to establish good relations with the native people of Puerto Rico, but raiding parties had already begun capturing slaves from that area. In 1522 he entered the Dominican order back on the island of Hispaniola and became a friar, leaving public life for a decade. He then travelled to Central America. In 1536, Las Casas followed a number of friars to Guatemala, where they began to prepare to undertake a mission among the Mayan Indians. They stayed in a convent that had been founded there some years earlier. Acting as a missionary among the Maya of Guatemala and participating in debates among colonial churchmen about how best to bring the natives to the Christian faith. The Dominicans and the Franciscans had a very different approach to the conversion of the Indians. The Franciscans used a method of mass conversion, sometimes baptising many thousands of Indians in a day. Las Casas made many enemies among the Franciscans for arguing that conversions made without adequate understanding were invalid. Travelling back to Spain to recruit more missionaries, he continued lobbying for the abolition of the encomienda, gaining an important victory by the passage of new laws in 1542. He was appointed a bishop in part of Mexico to the west of the Mayan lands, but only served for a short time before he was forced to return to Spain because of resistance to these new laws and conflicts with the Spanish settlers because of his pro-Indian policies. Bernardino and his activist religious stance was a Franciscan friar, and he served from Spain in the Spanish court for the remainder. He journeyed to New Spain, which is now Mexico, in 1529. He learned the Aztec language and spent more than 50 years in the study of Aztec beliefs, culture and history. Though he was primarily devoted to his missionary task, his extraordinary work documenting Indigenous worldview and culture has earned him the title as the first anthropologist. And he also contributed to the description of the Aztec language. He translated the Psalms, the Gospels, and a catechism into the local language. Juan de Estrada Rivago was a Franciscan friar from Spain. He went to Central America, to the areas of the modern-day nations of Honduras and Guatemala. However, he left his order and joined an expedition by conquistadors to Costa Rica. They all left Guatemala City with men and supplies to undertake the conquest of the province of Nueva Cartago, which is in central Costa Rica. Eventually, Ravago became the leader of this expedition. After arriving there, he learned the language of the Indians and generally refrained from violence against the native inhabitants. He then travelled through the area teaching the Christian faith, baptising and building churches. Out of his own pocket, he bought seed, clothes, and food for both the Indians and for any impoverished settlers. Ravago was eventually joined by 12 Franciscans from Mexico, and the church in Central America grew rapidly. His last years were spent as a parish priest and a vicar of Cartago. There were other Catholic missionaries who bravely stood up for the Native Americans, and as a result endured the opposition of both the Spanish government and from the Catholic Church itself. Gil Gonzalez de San Nicolas was a Dominican, and he arrived in Peru in 1547, and in the years 1556 to 1563 he lived in Santiago in Chile. Throughout his life, he opposed the unjust war and the massacres being waged by the Spanish soldiers against the native South Americans. Another Dominican who also spoke up was Luis Beltran, who arrived in Colombia in 1562. His fruitful mission work extended to the areas of Panama, where many thousands were baptised, and to the Lesser Antilles as well. For this, he's sometimes called the Apostle to the Americas. He clashed with the Spanish settlers over their treatment of the indigenous peoples, and he preached, according to the historian Justo Gonzalez, like an Old Testament prophet. In 1569, he returned to Spain and there pleaded the cause of the Native Americans. However, he was refused to return to the Americas, and he died in Spain in 1581. By the end of the 16th century, most of the indigenous peoples of Central America identified themselves as Christian. However, their understanding of what being a Christian meant was very limited. The number of priests was small, and those that were working in these areas were opposed by the conquistadors. Roque Gonzalez de Santa Cruz was born in 1576, the son of Spanish colonists in Asuncion, which is today part of the modern nation of Paraguay. Growing up, he learned the dialect of the local Indian people. Ordained a priest in 1598, he became a Jesuit in 1609. He began his missionary work in what is now known as Brazil, and he was the first European person to enter the region today known as the state of Rio Grande do Sul. In 1613, he organised the founding of a Jesuit mission in San Ignacio Mini, which is today part of Argentina. This was the first of many missions he helped establish in Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil. And these Jesuit missions were very important in protecting the indigenous people from the Spanish colonists. He was later killed in 1628 by a local ruler who feared the advancement of the missions. Although based on a later historical period, the 1986 film The Mission has the leading figure, Father Gabriel, who is loosely based on the life of this Jesuit, Roque Gonzalez de Santa Cruz. This map shows the expansion of Catholic mission into South America. The green colour shows the areas of missionary activity, while the brown shows Jesuit settlements. In the Jesuit missions that were located in modern-day countries of Argentina, Brazil and Paraguay, the local Guarani people were taught how to read and write, as well as being instructed in various other skills such as crafts. The Jesuits also concentrated on education, whereas the Franciscans focused more on caring for the poor and the sick. The Jesuits ran these missions for about 250 years before they were thrown out of the Spanish Empire in the year 1767. There were others who were concerned for the welfare of the African slaves. Slavery from Africa had begun around 1503, and by 1553, tens of thousands of slaves had been sent from Africa to areas such as the Caribbean. This was due to the decimation of the Native American people, largely as a result of new diseases that had come from Europe. The Jesuit Pedro Claver had arrived in South America in 1610 and spent much of his life in the city of Cartagena in Colombia. It is thought that over 1.1 million captive Africans entered the docks at Cartagena, according to the former director of the Colombian National Archives. It was there he noticed the treatment of the African slaves arriving, and he made a vow, Pedro Claver, forever a servant of the blacks. He began by communicating the gospel with the slaves using interpreters and caring for their physical needs. For example, he built a hospital and a leprosarium. Claver would go down to the wharf as soon as the slave ships entered the port. On boarding the ship, he would enter the filthy and diseased holds to treat and minister to their badly treated, terrified human cargo, who had survived a voyage under horrible conditions. It was difficult to move around on the ships because of the slave traffickers filled them to capacity. The slaves were often told that they were being taken to a land where they would be eaten. Claver would often give his own cloak to anyone who had need of it. After arriving, the slaves were herded together and penned in yards to be looked over by crowds of buyers, and Claver would continue to support them with medicine and food, giving them bread or brandy, lemons, even tobacco. With the help of interpreters and pictures which he carried with him, he gave them basic instructions on the Christian faith. He saw them as fellow human beings and encouraged others to treat them the same way. During the season when the slave ships were not accustomed to arrive, he travelled the country and he visited the plantations and gave spiritual support to the slaves. He avoided the hospitality of the planters and the overseers, and instead he would lodge with the slaves in their quarters. During the 40 years of his ministry, it's estimated that he personally catechized and baptized as many as 300,000 slaves. On his plantation visits, he would follow up on those he had baptized, ensuring that they were being treated humanely. His mission extended beyond caring for slaves, however. He also preached in the city square to the sailors and the traders. Now, while he didn't speak out openly against these injustices, he would show his disapproval of those he knew that owned slaves by, for example, not giving them the usual greeting when passing them in the street. Through his efforts, the treatment of slaves gradually improved. It should, however, be noted that Claver did buy slaves and had used corporal punishment at times. His defenders have argued that the sources from the time said that Claver allowed greater freedom for the slaves he had purchased, and he used them in his ministry rather than in hard labour, and that he had only resorted to physical punishment in instances of immoral behaviour. Eusebio Francisco Kino was from the region of Trent in modern-day Italy. He became a Jesuit and in 1681 made his way to the area of modern-day Mexico. For the next 24 years of his life, he worked in the region of northern Mexico and in what is today southern Arizona in the United States. He set up his first mission station in 1687, and in 1691 he made the first of about 40 expeditions into Arizona. He was the first European explorer of this area, and he made many useful maps. On the missions he established, he introduced fruit trees and cattle. He helped the Pima Indians to diverse their agriculture, and to the dismay of mine owners, he opposed the enslavement of Indians in the northern Mexican silver mines. He eventually established 24 missions and what are called visitas or country chapels in the regions in which he worked. Many of Kino's missions closed in 1767 when the Jesuits were expelled from all Spanish Catholic territories. There was over 650 Jesuits that were expelled from the territory known as New Spain, which is today part of Mexico and southwest United States. Spanish soldiers removed them from their 16 missions and 32 stations in Mexico. And no Jesuit, even they be old or ill, could be accepted from this decree. On the trek to the Gulf Coast port, where they were to board ships to go into exile to Italy, many of them died. Most of the extensive land holdings were taken over by the Spanish crown. The Jesuit missions in Baja California were turned over to the Franciscans and then subsequently to the Dominicans. And the future missions in the area known as Alta California were founded by Franciscans. Junipero Serra was a Franciscan who lived in the middle to the late part of the 18th century. He organised a long chain of missions into California and outside the official protection of Spanish rule. He initially founded a mission in Baja California. This was the first 9 of what would later become 21 Spanish missions along the western coast of the United States, from San Diego through to San Francisco. He also defended the rights of those Indians living under the Spanish rule. Some Spanish Jesuit missionaries had gone to the area of the modern-day US state of Georgia, but the indigenous Indian tribes resisted them, having resented the earlier provocation of Spanish explorers and soldiers. Those missionaries that survived the hostilities soon abandoned their attempts to bring the local people under the banner of the papacy, and they left. In the early part of the 17th century, the French began to settle in the area of modern-day Quebec in Canada, and Catholic missionaries and missions followed. Why were Catholic missions so successful? Well, firstly, there was a large number of missionaries, and they were very well resourced. In the 10 years following the establishment of the first Spanish colony in the West Indies in 1493, there was 125 priests, including 89 Franciscans and 32 Dominicans, and they went to evangelise an estimated 250,000 natives. The Catholic missionaries generally had the protection of the political authorities, and in addition had large resources available to them. This included materials for the building of churches, monasteries, along with books, trinkets for opening communication with the Indians, and subsistent items. There was the establishment of missions. The civil authorities and church people agreed that the separation of the Indians into their own villages was the best policy. For the colonists, it assured better control of the native people and family groups. And for the missionary priests, it made their indoctrination and Christianisation more effective. There was forced conversions. So many Indians converted out of fear. Most historians broadly agree that the native populations that converted in South and Central America did so under the threat of violence. Often, they were compelled to do so after being conquered, and that the Catholic Church cooperated with the civil authority to achieve this. Gonzalez said, "They quake in fear before the governor, and that fear is enough for us to teach them. It helps them hear the word of God." There was the example of some Catholic missionaries. We've seen the example of Pedro Claver in Colombia. There was also the willingness of the Jesuits, for example, to identify with culture and language. We saw this with Ritchie in China. There perhaps was the idea of perceived superiority of the European civilization, which then in turn led to the belief that the God of the conquerors must be superior to their own gods. There was perhaps an element of self-interest. There was a desire for the native inhabitants to advance themselves by identifying with the conquerors. In India, for example, many of the lower caste were eager to accept Christianity in order to achieve a raising in their social status. They thought that by becoming Christians, they would join the caste of the Portuguese. Baroque is a period which included changes in art, architecture, and music. It followed the period known as the Renaissance. Baroque was encouraged by the Catholic Church as a means to counter the simplicity and the austerity of the Protestant architecture, art, and music, though Lutheran Baroque art developed in parts of Europe as well. According to the church historian Earl Cairns, quote, "Baroque architecture expressed the triumphalism of the church," meaning the Catholic Church. Cairns referred to the example of the facade on St. Peter's in Rome, as well as its altar canopy in the church, which he said proclaimed the, quote, "majesty of the church." Baroque aimed to achieve a sense of awe. While Lutherans and other Protestants had reintroduced communal singing of hymns and the Psalms, music in the Catholic Church took a different course. Giovanni Palestrina was a Baroque composer who wrote music for the church. However, his works were to be sung by choirs, not by the laity. His Missa Papae Marcelli, or Pope Marcellus Mass, was sung at papal coronation masses. Palestrina's music influenced what is called counterpoint and polyphony in music. We've now come to the end of our examination of the Catholic Church's response to the Protestant Reformation. In our next video, we'll return to the events of the Reformation, focusing on the nation of England, noting how the Reformation changed that nation